Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about the real purpose behind US President Trump imposing tariffs on the EU. It's to divide Europe. In addition, British media say that China has reached a milestone that changes the rules of the game. The New York Times, on the other hand, says this is how Trump is making China great again. Trump published a tariff letter to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on his self-created social media platform, Truth Social. He announced that starting August 1st, the U.S. will impose a 30% tariff on EU sales of American-made products. Trump also threatened that the EU must provide the U.S. with completely open market access, and that it cannot impose retaliatory tariffs. He said, "No matter how much you choose to raise your tariffs, I will add the same amount on top of the 30% base." Bloomberg says that Trump's trade agenda continues to catch allies off guard. The EU originally thought it could reach a preliminary agreement with the US to avoid being unilaterally hit with tariffs by America. According to Politico's Sina report, an EU diplomat recently told them with optimism that before reaching an agreement, they did not expect to receive a letter from Trump imposing unilateral tariffs like those sent to Japan and South Korea. The EU originally planned to cancel the digital tax imposed on American tech giants in exchange for a deal with the US. But this seems to have been all in vain. According to data from the U.S. Department of Commerce, in 2024 the EU's goods trade surplus with the U.S. was $235.6 billion, ranking second among all economies with a surplus against the U.S., only behind China's $295.4 billion. On April 2nd, the U.S. originally announced a tariff rate of 20% on the EU, but now, instead of decreasing, it has increased. The US has unilaterally announced that it will raise it to 30%. The EU is like a pile of loose sand. The main negotiator with the US, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, is seen by Trump as both a weak opponent and the kind of liberal he dislikes most, so he chose to come down hard on the EU. And the fact that the EU kept saying they thought Trump wouldn't unilaterally send a letter imposing tariffs on the EU just shows how badly von der Leyen misjudged the situation. Now Trump is slapping a 30% tariff on the EU, which basically means that if the EU fully accepts all of America's terms, the tariff can be reduced by 20%. Otherwise, you'll just have to swallow it. This is the Vietnam model. Originally, the tariff on Vietnamese products sold to the US was announced as 46% on April 2nd, but after both sides reached an agreement, it was lowered to 20%. But at the same time, Vietnam had to impose zero tariffs on American goods. Afterwards, news came out from Vietnam that they originally thought the US would lower the tariff on their goods to 11%, but Trump suddenly announced it would be 20% and claimed that the two countries had already reached an agreement, which put Vietnam in a very passive position. Now Trump wants to use the same tactic on the EU. Trump's ambitions toward the EU probably go beyond just imposing tariffs and reducing the US trade deficit with them. The analysis by the UK's Sunday Telegraph was spot on. It said, since the US only imposes a 10% tariff on British goods, this means that the 30% tariff the EU has to pay on exports to the US will be 3 times what the UK has to pay. Because of this, some British politicians say this also proves that Brexit has tangible benefits. Looking at it from another angle, even if an agreement is eventually reached and the US imposes a 20% tariff on EU goods, it still proves that Brexit has its advantages. Trump's motivation to divide the EU is quite obvious. On one hand, breaking up the EU benefits the US, because a strong EU can stand up to the US. For example, the euro is another alternative currency to the US dollar. On the other hand, breaking up the EU benefits Russia. Trump and Putin are very friendly with each other. If more countries leave the EU, it could help rescue Russia from its weak position. In Trump's imagined new Yalta model, where the US, China, and Russia are the 3 major powers, the side representing Europe should have been the EU. But Trump doesn't like working with the liberal left, and since he's very friendly with Putin, Russia has become, in his eyes, the representative of Europe. Just imagine, if Trump's actions against the EU are effective and major European countries experience political turmoil, there will inevitably be more far-right parties coming to power. A divided Europe would be even less able to compete with the United States. It can be summed up like this. First, in recent years, the major EU countries have squandered a strong hand. Since the Russia-Ukraine war began more than 3 years ago, Europe's GDP has only increased by 1.9%, while energy prices have surged by 300%. Europe's economy lags behind the United States, and is even further behind China. Europe's support for Ukraine joining NATO has proven to be an act of self-harm for Europe. Second, after Trump took office, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wanted to counterbalance China with the US, missing the opportunity to join forces with China to fight US tariffs. After China and the US reached an agreement, Europe fell into the dangerous situation of confronting the US, with Trump keeping a close eye. Third, it has become clear that the United States intends to join forces with Russia to divide the European Union. In addition, I want to talk about China's recent carbon reduction efforts, which have reached a globally significant milestone. This success has certainly made foreign media realize that China's dominance in new energy is growing ever stronger. According to a report by the BBC, the climate change science and policy website Carbon Brief recently released a report showing that, even as China's economic activity and energy demand continue to rise, China's carbon emissions actually dropped by about 1.6% in the first quarter of this year compared to last year. In the 12 months leading up to this May, China's carbon emissions also fell by about 1%. This means that China's carbon emissions have very likely already peaked ahead of schedule. China's original goal was to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030. On July 9th, the BBC published an article stating that China has likely reached a game-changing milestone. It considers this a moment worth celebrating, because for the first time, China has managed to reduce its carbon emissions while maintaining economic growth, something that previously only happened when the economy slowed down. China is deploying renewable energy technologies at a record-breaking pace, and is very likely to play an important leadership role in global climate action in the future. The BBC quoted expert Millie Verda's analysis, saying that the decline in China's carbon emissions is largely thanks to China's investment in renewable energy. In recent years, China's installed capacity for wind and solar power has accounted for more than half of the global total. Last year, China's newly installed solar power capacity was equivalent to the entire installed capacity of the European Union, which is an astonishing rate of growth. The UK-based energy think tank Amber also noted that in April this year, for the first time, wind and solar power accounted for more than 25% of China's electricity generation. In the first 4 months of this year, China's fossil fuel power generation dropped by 3.6% year-on-year. Analysts say this change is highly significant for China, an economy that has long relied on coal-fired power. China is not only rapidly deploying renewable energy technologies, but is also the world's largest producer of renewable energy equipment. According to the BBC, Chinese companies are world leaders in clean energy technology, producing 60% of the world's wind turbines and 80% of the world's solar panels. Experts generally believe that leading technology and manufacturing capacity are key for China to balance its carbon emissions. Thomas Friedman, a renowned author at the New York Times, directly pointed out on July 4 that Trump's Great American Law has made China great again in the field of new energy, raising similar issues. After the Great American Law was passed, Friedman said, "Can you hear the huge cheers coming from the East? Those are the voices of people in China laughing at Americans. The Chinese simply can't believe their luck." Just as the era of energy-hungry artificial intelligence is about to arrive, the US president and his party are engaging in what can only be described as the most severe act of strategic self-sabotage imaginable. They passed a massive bill filled with all sorts of crazy provisions, including deliberately undermining America's ability to generate electricity from renewable sources, especially solar, electromagnetic, and wind power. Why is that? Because Trump and others see these as liberal sources of energy, even though nowadays they are powering the growth of America's electric grid and are the fastest and cheapest way to meet the surging electricity demand from AI data centers. This is the exact opposite of what China is doing. In fact, Beijing might have already marked July 4th, the day the US passed this bill, as a national holiday, calling it America's Electricity Dependence Day. This is the kind of plot you couldn't make up. Even Saudi Arabia is doubling down on solar investments to meet the electricity needs of the AI data centers it wants to attract from the West. But Trump's Great American Bill is doing exactly the opposite. This bill rapidly and systematically eliminates tax credits for utility-scale solar and wind power, as well as tax breaks for electric vehicles, practically guaranteeing that China will own the future of solar, wind, electric cars and trucks, and autonomous vehicles. In short, this messy string of bills was rushed through without consulting any independent energy experts, and not even a single scientist was called to testify. It will undoubtedly jeopardize billions of dollars of investment in the renewable energy sector and could cost tens of thousands of American workers and related industries their jobs. He said that China understands this very clearly, the connection between a country's ability to produce large amounts of electricity at an affordable price and in the cleanest way possible, and my ability to develop artificial intelligence engines, has never been as close as it is now. In the process of AI learning and generating answers, these engines consume a huge amount of electricity, and the answers provided by AI can give us the tools we need to treat diseases, discover new materials, and even achieve the holy grail of energy fusion power that could save the climate. In other words, the amount of cheap and clean electricity a country can produce for AI models has never been so closely linked to that country's future economic and military power. He said that very few Americans realize that China is already far ahead of the United States in this field, and is moving forward at an even faster pace every day. He said, "Take a look at this summary. In the year 2000, 25 years ago, China's electricity generation had just surpassed 1,300 terawatt-hours, while the United States was already close to 3,000 terawatt-hours at that time, 3 times that of China. 25 years later, China's electricity generation has surpassed 10,000 terawatt-hours, while the United States has only increased its electricity generation by 500 terawatt-hours since 2000, totaling 4,300 terawatt-hours. The United States has only increased its electricity generation by 13%, while China's electricity generation now more than double that of the United States. China's growth in electricity was driven by the expansion of coal-fired power, but recently, by the expansion of hydropower, solar, wind, and nuclear energy. The development of these energy sources is easier, cheaper, faster, and more beneficial for climate protection. As a recent article from the Financial Times, reporting from Shanghai, put it, China is becoming the world's first electrified nation, with electricity making up an increasingly large share of its energy, and its economy is increasingly driven by clean technologies. Freeman gave a very good summary, saying he is convinced that there are now only 2 political parties in the world cheering for the passage of this great American bill,